we once met each other on the battlefield and maybe we used some sort of tool against one another. And then maybe we realized that with the evolution of military technology, I could stand a little bit further away from you and still excise some sort of cost. And then eventually I don't have to meet you on the battlefield at all, but I can sit somewhere in a bunker and I can still ensure that violence is dealt to you. And yet, in all of those instances, it's still me, right? Still me on this other side deciding that this is the instrument of violence that I want to deliver. And we're now at this next inflection point where perhaps the systems that we're trying to produce are going to take over the decision to commission violence in the first place.
When we talk about digital divides, I worry that the gap between people using it as an answer engine versus using it to help provide you with better thinking, that's going to be the problem.
We need to understand always what the funding model is and what is the political system behind any tool that our kids are using.
AI is not some machine god somewhere up in the sky. It's a physical building on someone else's land, drinking up someone's water.
You can make a robot to sort of be anthropomorphically credible. People, when they have a conversation with it, they think there's a human mind behind it.
What if virtual reality can be our training platform where we can interact with others without actually hurting them?
And we're now at this next sort of inflection point where perhaps the systems that we're trying to produce are going to take over the decision to commission violence in the first place.
It's not a technology problem, it's a leadership problem right now.
It's one thing to overcome death for human beings, but we're dealing with an age of AI where maybe it won't even be human beings that conquer death. It'll be sort of like AI that takes over the world.
What kind of society do we want AI to help us build? Because if we don't answer that intentionally, these other forces are going to answer it for us.
Welcome to a new season of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season, we're exploring empathy in the era of AI.
Together with my expert guests, we dive into armed conflict, ed tech, neocolonialism, transhumanism, online abuse, the future of work, and so much more.
You don't want to miss a single episode, so hit that subscribe button now. And if you like what you hear, post a comment and share the show.
Hey, welcome. There's a lot of noise about AI right now, bunch of predictions and promises and warnings, and it's really hard to make sense of things. But as someone who spent the past 15 years studying empathy, I want to know how AI will impact how we treat one another. So instead of forming an opinion from the sidelines, I decided to speak with 20 AI experts to explore how artificial intelligence will reshape our society and our relationships. There's a lot at stake, so I hope you'll join me on this learning journey. Today, my guest is Dr. Adam McCauley, a policy analyst concerned about how AI is impacting geopolitics, national security, military decision-making, and armed conflict. In this conversation, we explore the price of certainty in AI-driven decision-making, the trade-offs between speed and human judgment, the changing nature of war and moral injury, and why empathy and human fallibility may be essential safeguards. If you want to understand how AI is transforming geopolitics and warfare, this show is for you.
So welcome to the show, Adam. I am so excited to have this conversation because the timing of it could not be better. Of course, this is going to get posted in a few weeks. I imagine the geopolitics will not be much better, potentially starker. So thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Okay, so I am on a mission through this series to sort of I've spent 15 years thinking about empathy, and now this big topic, AI, has kind of come to everyone's attention, and I haven't really solved the issue of what are the implications for empathy. So I'm speaking to a lot of experts on a lot of different topics, and you are a policy analyst who focuses on the intersection of technology and international relations. You're currently writing a book on artificial intelligence, military and political decision-making, and the future of conflict. But before we get into all of that, I would love to know a little bit about you as a human being. So we've got people who are watching and listening. What do you think could color in some of the, let's not pigeonhole you based on that little bio.
Yeah, no, so the story I often tell is that eventually when I grow up, I'll figure out what I want to do with my life. And so I think if you met me in 5-year increments and you asked me what the next 5 years would look like, I would have guessed wrong each time. I come from a small town tucked in the west coast of Canada, and I like to say I escaped. That's not really true, but I certainly moved on and out. I took a tour through the world of journalism, which was my first career, I suppose we could think about it that way. And then I moved back into the academy and spent a lot of time thinking about international relations, international security, and as if maybe to complete the third leg of the stool, decided that, what better place to explore than government, which is where I currently sit. And along the way, I feel like I've gravitated towards similar complex puzzles and problems. I'm first to tell you that I have no solutions, but I've learned how to ask better questions over time, and I think that's all we can sort of aim for. But yeah, let's just consider me sort of a mind loosed on the world and trying to figure out what it's all about.
And I hope that I'll ask some good questions along the way. And if there's something you feel that I'm not addressing that was really important to you to talk about, let's make sure to get there. So you've already mentioned that you were a journalist, right? Early in your career, you studied violence up close, reporting on conflict and politics and international security. And I know that you've been nominated for a number of industry awards. You've appeared in New York Times, The Atlantic, New Yorker, Time Magazine, Al Jazeera. I mean, those are sort of like the A-listing. So bravo. I think on a personal level, I'd like to know, was there ever a moment that changed how you understand the human cost of policy or security decisions based on your reporting?
Oh, it's a good question. I think about it a lot. I think about it in two ways. So there's depending on where you sit, and certainly as a journalist, you sort of seem to volley between two very different levels. One is this sort of boots on the ground, for lack of a better term, up close and personal experience in a space and trying your best to tell a story in that environment that both captures what you're feeling and communicates in some similar fashion why that story matters to an audience elsewhere. And I bring up those two levels because I think most of us struggle with the incomprehensibility almost of the complexity around some of these things. And, the reporting experience that sticks out most to me when I think about this isn't so much conflict, but I remember covering the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. And, being sort of stuck amidst incredible amounts of uncertainty, and struggling to figure out how you can tell a story that does justice to those around you and could communicate to those who will never experience this moment alongside you what it's like and why it matters, was daunting, and daunting in ways that I don't think have wrapped my head around. What I think is challenging about the environment where you tell those stories, however, is that care, right? Care isn't a capitalist good. So we got 7 days on the ground to try and tell a story of the destruction of a capital city that affected millions of lives. And guess what? When we left, when I say we, any foreign correspondent who left in that moment afterwards was met with local reporters more or less saying, well, look at the voyeurs go, right? They all showed up. They sort of feasted on us for a little while and off they went. And what's really tricky about that dynamic is that I absolutely wouldn't have done anything differently. I would have showed up just the same over and over again, regardless of the charge. But there's a sense in which we can only episodically care about the things that seem to percolate in kind of our media environment at any given moment. And we miss the fact that when we leave, those lives continue. And so failing to create an environment where you can really tell a story over time, that you sort of create the impetus or the incentive to hold attention over time, really, I think, degrades the experience of being there specifically. And I think reporters, the longer they spend and the more times they go in and out of these environments, they carry kind of that baggage with them. They know that they've left stories untold. They know that they've left lives sort of unconcluded. And in some ways, that is the role of kind of the reporter in that moment. but it challenges us to really think about how and why those stories matter, what we do it for, and if that practice actually brings us closer to our audience, but also closer to the experience of those that we spend so much time with in the moment.
It's echoing. I was just listening today. So we're taping this on March 12th, and I was watching an interview between Stephen Colbert and Clarissa Ward, I want to say, from CNN.
Yeah.
So she's in Iraq, about 60 kilometers or so away from Iran. And one of the claims that she was making is that because there's a blackout of the internet, we're not actually seeing the human toll. And I think that's something that you are talking about. And I'm also reminded of, I have a good friend who's a photojournalist, and he brought to my attention that there was this gentleman, also a photojournalist by the name of, I want to say Kevin Hart, but I could be wrong about that. I think Kevin Hart is a comedian, but is Kevin somebody? Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist who many years ago in Sudan took an iconic photograph of a child that was emaciated and a vulture waiting nearby.
Mm-hmm.
And he won a prize for that, and went to the gala in New York City. He was dressed to the nines, the limousine and the whole 9 yards, and then shortly thereafter committed suicide. I think I'm thinking about, from an empathic perspective, the important work you're trying to do to communicate a story on behalf of people who are suffering, let's say, or need our attention, and then the load that you carry walking away from that, and how you somehow reintegrate yourself into society again and carry on, knowing what's there behind you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first magazine pieces that I worked on as a journalist, and something that remains with me now, was on a photographer named Ashley Gilbertson, and Ash and I were friends for many years, and he reports, or let's say his experience in Iraq was telling in just the same way. He accompanied a number of U.S. Marines up into a minaret because he wanted a photo, or because he needed a photo to prove that this was a space in which the insurgents were waging war, something that the New York Times at the time wanted verification of, and would be useful for calibrating, I guess, the story of this conflict as it was emerging. And unfortunately, one of the Marines that had to clear that minaret before he did, walked up those stairs first, was shot and killed. And he carried that, and carries that to this day, with him. And so this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder for the observers, right, the witnesses too, is real. Moral injury, I think, as we often refer to it now, is a real tax, a real cost. It is one that's often, I think, for those that pursue this career, it's often the cost worth paying for what they think and what they know they are contributing to, which is a more fulsome understanding of what conflict is like and what it excises from those that are exposed to it, often without their choice. But it isn't to say that this is an easy load to bear, nor is it one that you can expect in advance in terms of how you would sort of comport yourself to it, or what might happen to you along the way.
I think that's a fair assessment. And I think it makes you probably really good in your role now as a policy analyst, focusing on the intersection of technology and international relations. So more specifically, the social and political implications of AI in political and military decision-making. Like, when I started thinking about AI and I knew about the work that you do, I was like, holy smokes, it hadn't even crossed my mind how AI could enter that domain of life. So I think many people feel uneasy about that. I certainly do, about how AI could be used to make geopolitical and military decisions. So, like, what are your thoughts at a sort of high level?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And look, I'll put my cards on the table early. I've stumbled backwards into this topic as much as anybody else. I spent a lot of time thinking about the international system, international security challenges across the board, how states as units and agents and actors in this space navigate this uncertainty, how political decision makers have to cue themselves in an uncertain environment to the information around them to make decisions without any certainty in terms of the outcome. And lo and behold, as I sort of move inside the building a few years back in government, we've got this sort of cresting energy and attention around artificial intelligence. And here we're talking about kind of the machine learning age, as it were, so the open AI announcements in those early days. And a real promise, a promise made more or less by those who were building the tools themselves, that this was some sort of magic alchemy that, if appropriately trained and directed, could start to make a lot of decisions that are already complicated and enduringly complex a little bit faster, a little bit more effective, and dare I say efficient. And I think that that's a reasonable argument for some domains of human life. That's a reasonable argument for some decision environments. That's a reasonable argument for all of the tedious to-dos on our, day-to-day plates, as it were. They may or may not be offloaded to, an engine that can take care of them more effectively. Where it started to bother me, and where I think it sort of gets everybody's, hair up on the back of their necks, is that when we move into decision environments that are very high risk, that are very uncertain, endemically so, persistently so, these are not the machines for us. These are not the tools for us. There's no thinking necessarily that goes into anything that they produce. And as a result, they perform a kind of certainty for individuals who use them in ways that, under the wrong conditions anyway, can have pretty significant consequences. And so in these early moments inside government, I was worried about something I talk about in terms of credibility creep, right? So all of a sudden, the Microsoft Copilot you use to help summarize a document that you didn't quite read also becomes the tool you use to navigate a slightly more complicated intelligence puzzle that you're trying to sort out. And maybe at the heart of the question around this information that you're trying to navigate is the intention of another actor, right? And that's certainly the story of international affairs. We were consistently trying to think our way in, maybe through strategic empathy, as it were, think our way into the position of another to see or to think through what the implications are of them acting X, Y, or Z, and maybe to give us some insight in terms of what we would do either in advance or certainly immediately in response to those types of questions. The challenge here, though, is that we can't know and won't know what's going on in the minds of others. And that's just an endemic social reality that we live with day in and day out. And so we have to be careful that we don't imagine a machine is going to solve that kind of complexity for us. And I think that's where, for me, this collision of technology and institution, or this technology and sort of social intersection, becomes far more concerning, to put it mildly.
Yeah, because what comes up when I'm hearing you talk about that is, well, first of all, there's a lot of research looking at the brain-gut axis connection, and that we actually have, like, when we say a gut instinct, like, it turns out that we actually do. We have a brain there, and maybe there's ways that we can intuit very subtly texts when we're reading them that a machine won't be able to do, right? And that's just being taken out of the equation, and with implications, I would guess.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stories that I often tell, trying to sort of make this more tangible, perhaps, is that at the heart of much of our technological innovation are just a set of really complicated mathematical equations, right? Very complex, so much so that someone like myself who doesn't wrestle with numbers just stays away from. However, one of the patterns that we might identify within this space is like a classic Bayesian updating, right? This is how decisions get refined over time. More information changes the parameters of the question and or the mathematics, and we get closer and closer to what we think is an optimal or ideal solution. So there's a chronology to that, right? That means that information that arrives after becomes more relevant and therefore changes the way the decision, or at least that decision space, looks. So if we then take that assumption that this is kind of how technology takes us, down this road of complex decision making, or how it churns through its data, and then we put ourselves in a very clear, very well evidenced historical period in which individuals had to navigate uncertainty, we see, a potential collision in the wrong way. And so what I'm thinking about here is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so famously, we can think about this as the story of two memos. an initial memo that comes in from the Kremlin, as it were, and into the White House, which seems to be suggesting a far more pacific, staid, moderate approach that the Soviet Union was going to take, at least in its next gambit in that crisis. And lo and behold, some hours later, a second memo arrives. This one far more bullish, far more aggressive, certainly shrinking the space in which they might find common cause to de-escalate. And the brother of the president at the time, Robert F. Kennedy, sits there and says, you know what? I'm going to respond to the first one. I'm not going to respond to the second one. That is, at least in terms of our technical understanding of how we think about the world and how new information changes kind of the reality, that wouldn't and couldn't necessarily happen in this instance, right? Number one, the processes at play within the technological side are so much faster. We wouldn't necessarily be attentive to how that information was being processed and what pattern was being identified. But it speaks to a sense of pause, a sense of moderation that comes from kind of that humble standing of not being certain what might be true of that other environment that seems to be telling us something. And I think that if there is sort of an off-ramp for human disaster historically, it's been that deep-seated knowledge that we don't know everything about what our adversary is thinking. And might that not be reason for pause instead of action? And I think those are the spaces where technology really throws not necessarily a wrench, but it certainly wrinkles what is already going to be a highly reactive decision space and one with very significant or stark costs.
So I guess this is a good moment to mention that you're in the process of writing a book. I believe the working title that you're using is The Price of Certainty. And now I understand that better because you're talking about certainty and uncertainty. So what's your goal of this book? And what do you hope readers will take away? As soon as it comes out, we'll update the show notes so people know how to find it.
Yeah, it's very kind. I mean, this has sort of been the best and worst undertaking all at once. Trying to write about technology that is in rapid sort of transition is always difficult. But where I find this book has really, I guess, settled in terms of a project is that this is a recurring social phenomena for us as, humans forced into this largely incomprehensible world with far too many things happening seemingly all at once, and us as, limited cognitive beings trying to make sense of it. And so the way in which I understand kind of our current AI age is just yet another precipice where, standing and looking into that somewhat dark future, we are persuaded by advances in technology in our present moment, in the sense that they might open up or cast at least a little bit more light into the future that allows us to forecast or predict in ways that we couldn't before. And I think that's very much that's the packaged sort of commercial value that's being offered by those that are producing these technologies. And it's precisely what makes them most appealing. But in that same sense, it's sort of no different than rewinding to the 1950s and 60s when applied social science really sort of took that banner and ran with it as well. And we thought, oh, well, if we can model more proxies and more variables across social spaces, then, number one, that's the evidence-based approach we need to take for policy making. There's a way in which we can cast light into that unknown future and give us a little bit more credibility and leverage when we argue for what we should do now. And all of these are imperfect solutions. I think what's different about this present moment is it seems these technologies, while they've been in development for many, many decades, they're co-presenting with a geopolitical story right now, or geopolitical narrative, that seems to suggest that those that take advantage of these technologies first will be the ones that win in this game. And I think that sets in motion a number of fundamental challenges for us. And so the book is a plea, as it were, to those in spaces where they can, regulate or offer caution, pause, or red lines around how we use these technologies to say, hold on a second, we need to understand more about what the macro sort of implications of moving these types of systems into certain domains might be. And we have to be attentive to the fact that there are a lot of incentives in this game and they're not all aligned, and they're certainly not all in search of the same outcome. And so whether that's the private sector and the eagerness that they would obviously have in sort of being heavily invested in essentially the most durable contract you'll have, which is the national security of any state, or it's the state itself, which is trying in this moment to figure out ways in which it can deliver on its fundamental responsibility to its citizens, which is the security and prosperity of its population. And so the stakes are really high. The language is quite sort of bombastic, and it is certainly evocative. And it's also a moment where I think the average citizen is sitting there saying, like, well, what the hell am I going to do? Like, how do I get involved in this? I don't even know enough about what I should be upset and or worried about.
Yeah.
And more importantly, these tools are being folded into spaces that historically have not been open to my oversight in the first place. So how am I supposed to watch and or assess whether or not my government is doing what's in our best interest? So it's a series of overlapping challenges with no good solutions, but there certainly has to be a conversation, and I hope that that's what the book more or less makes space for.
Well, thank you for writing that, because it certainly has echoes of, I think I watched a video with Tristan Harris talking about like what we're doing right now is exactly the definition of insanity. I'll put that in the show notes too, because it's a worthwhile catching. Okay.
For sure.
So, as AI becomes more involved in military and political decision making, I wonder what other risks you might see. So, for example, I'm concerned about what it means for service members to have psychological distance from the human consequences of war.
Yeah. So I think, every solution is itself a problem. And so I think one of the ways in which I think about AI's influence in this space is that if we take the hypothetical, how do I want to say this? If I want to explain how, let's say, two of the largest states in the international system would think about fighting a conflict today, right? A macro level conflict. The theory of victory that those states have is predicated on the same thing. It is an assumption that they will be able to move faster, make decisions faster than their adversary. And what that means is it gets their decision cycle, as it is, gets inside and speeds faster than their adversary can react. And there is a certain amount of damage and or destruction that can be created in short order so that the other side will more or less step down. Now, even in our present moment, where we're not seeing major countries sort of clash, that same logic still carries, right? What these tools do is it speeds cycles of action. What that also means, and the hedge that we tend to use, is that, as long as we can keep humans in the loop, right? Humans watching what's happening, we still won't, we will still hold and or preserve kind of that moral authority that we ought to have when we make decisions that involve the life and death of another. And I think early signs suggest that your concerns are valid, that there is a distancing that happens through these systems, be it the fact that it simply moves so fast that the time at which we might consider the action before it's undertaken or executed is shorter, or that the calculation, complex as it might be, probabilistic as it often is also so distinct and different from how we, as living, breathing, skin and bones humans, would actually consider the death of another living thing. There is a certain technical specificity to the delivery of violence in this way that I think does change how we shape ourselves to it. I'm not sure what the long tail of this story is. There's any number of I think the research that's been done on like drone warriors, as it were, not the first person sort of autonomous ones, but the ones that are actually operated by humans sitting somewhere far off and staring at a screen. It's possible that there is a distancing effect there in terms of how they feel morally responsible for what happens. But it's also clear that moral injury is very high for individuals who use that, who are essentially responsible in this way. And so, is this sort of a tax we haven't yet felt? Will this be one more thing that we come to realize, kind of in hindsight, that we've 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 handed over a key human responsibility and a key sort of value and principle for our being, or at least as human beings themselves, and we'll have to roll that back, perhaps. But that unfortunately runs directly counter to kind of the operational and tactical utility of these tools in the first place, right? And so, whether the twain shall meet is, I think, very much up for debate right now.
Yeah, because I interviewed for last season a vet, a U.S. Vet who served in Afghanistan and in Iraq and Purple Heart and was injured, had moral injury, like was a speaker, who shared with me what he called the spiritual nature of taking someone's life. And I imagine, like, back in the day when we would picture two soldiers on a field, that it was very up close and personal. And now if you layer into even asymmetry, power asymmetry in a situation, like what the psychic implications are of that in the long run for humanity, what that means. I don't know if there's really a response to that. I just sort of put that out there, that's something to think about.
Yeah, and I mean, what this speaks to, I think, is just a challenge socially today anyway, right? We live in technologically enveloped worlds. We see the world through, and again, this isn't the filter bubble chat, this isn't all that stuff. We simply live our lives through technological means in ways that are distinct from times past. And I think that there is something both incredibly natural in sort of the definitional sense of the word about life and death, and there is something evolutionary, as it were, about the role that type of harm has played in the human story. That there is this strange, moment of reckoning right now, which is to say, if we outsource all of our violence, both in terms of how it's commissioned, the tools we use, but increasingly how it's decided upon, that is actually fundamentally different, right? Because again, to take your earlier point, we once met each other on the battlefield, and maybe we used some sort of tool against one another. And then maybe we realized that with the evolution of military technology, I could stand a little bit further away from you and still excise some sort of cost. And then eventually I don't have to meet you on the battlefield at all, but I can sit somewhere in a bunker and I can still ensure that violence is dealt to you. And yet, in all of those instances, it's still me, right? Still me on this other side deciding that this is the instrument of violence that I want to deliver. And we're now at this next sort of inflection point where perhaps the systems that we're trying to produce are going to take over the decision to commission violence in the first place. And we become both participants and spectators all at once in that. And that is a different experience. And I have to imagine that it changes the way that we think about risk, changes the way that we think about the value of human life. And that distance is not going to help us with what I think is central to our conversation today, and I think your work more generally, which is how do we imagine ourselves into the lives of others? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's as easy to do if not for the ability to actually meet someone physically in person and in place. And so those are real concerns for us today and for how we choose to treat each other in the years to come.
Yeah, I really take that on board. I want to speak to the current context because we're right now just a little under 2 weeks away from, or 2 weeks into the attack on Iran and what that's going to mean for the region and the world potentially. But I want to ask a final question here at a general level, like what your thoughts are about governments using AI-driven surveillance in ways that erode democratic freedoms in the name of security. If you're concerned, and if so, what should other concerned citizens do about this?
Yeah. I mean, in no way am I a mouthpiece for my current government nor other governments in this respect. One of the slightly glib stories that I will tell here, or at least anecdotes I'll tell here, is not to discredit sort of the concern around surveillance, which I think is a real one, but it's also to say that I sort of wish governments were unified enough to have actually come up with any number of, Big Brother type conspiracies that were often sort of thrown at government and sort of governments are blamed for. But it's often the case that governments are very confused about what it is that they're doing all across the board, and the degree of organization that would be required, I think, to sort of build a Big Brother type surveillance state. I mean, it would be a significant undertaking for any government to do. That said, what I do think is fundamentally amiss in our present moment and is worryingly inflected by the technologies that are available and at the cost at which they're available is that we actually don't have a durable social contract right now in our present moment, right? As citizens, given how government over the last 30 or 40 years, and governments here, I'm more or less speaking about North American and European experience, experience in this governance space, we've offloaded a lot of public goods responsibilities to the private sector. And so as citizens, it seems like we have far less control through voting rights alone over the shape of our lives and or the services that we think we are owed. You complicate that further by the fact that most of the ways in which the government both understands and communicates to its citizens is also through infrastructure that's not theirs anymore. And so what's difficult to understand in this present moment is like, where do we as citizens have leverage to press for change and or protect ourselves if the one entity that we actually do have a durable political relationship and responsibility to and from is actually far more limited in their ability to shape the world as we experience it. And so one of the things that worries me a little bit is how we understand this public-private partnership around key technological sectors as we move forward. And so we see them being increasingly integrated, obviously, into the defense and military environment. We sort of understand why that is the case, and it's certainly in the interest of the private sector to do so. But it does cramp and or crowd out, I think, the space that citizens ought to have, which is to say, no. Like, I need to be able to control how these tools are being used, or at least understand how I can influence the cost benefit so that I preserve the rights and freedoms that I know are mine. And more importantly, that we deliver public goods, whether it's everything from healthcare to you name it, in ways that are more representative of what we think citizens in our present age are owed as a function of, allegiance to, or at least support for their national governments. And so that's a long and winding way of saying I'm certainly concerned about how these tools get used by government, but I almost wonder whether or not the bigger concern is how governments are being used by the private sector who delivers these tools, and where that balance of influence sits and rests over the next 5 or 10 years will greatly influence the shape of both politics and also, I guess, democracy, if we want to take it, or if we want to see it at that level.
And I hope I see in short order in my lifetime, but certainly like in the next decade, an overturn of Citizens United.
For sure.
All right, so let's talk about now. In light of the recent attack on Iran and the regional tensions that are following, I think right now we're starting to see attacks on Lebanon. Do you see AI, whether it's cyber warfare, surveillance, targeting systems, changing the way things in the Middle East and beyond will unfold?
Mm, it's a good question. I mean, the age-old question on the technology side is sort of how we think about it as being an input or a variable that changes this space. And the reason I use that language is mostly because I'm sadly a social scientist by trade, so I have to kind of think of how all of these things work together so that I don't say anything too silly. But it's also the case that I think there's something enduring about the nature of war, right? So there is something persistent and recurrent about the way in which we often find reasons to fight and or aggress towards each other. It's the character of conflict that seems to be shaped by technology right now. And so part of that is captured, or at least was captured in previous comments around speed. So the speed of military operations seems to be increasing, largely because these automated systems, and that can be both AI enabled or otherwise, are now capable of pulling in a vast amount of information and producing target lists in shorter order, which means that we can deploy more armaments faster to more diverse regions and areas in quick succession. Those same technologies are being used in response as well. So much of what we're seeing reported in the Middle East right now in terms of, debris falling from the sky in places that aren't being specifically targeted, those are the results of surface-to-air missile defense that are taking advantage of those same technologies to essentially, nullify and or destroy armaments or artillery as they're coming in, or weapon systems as they're flying into these spaces. I think one of the more evident use cases for artificial intelligence at present, or at least a subject of more in-depth reporting, would be the Israeli government's use in its territory or its adjoining territories, in terms of targeting lists for what they believe to be insurgent affiliated individuals, and how they've been able to prosecute far more targets per day, as it were, than they used to be able to prosecute in months or years. I think a lot of this sort of gets us back into this question about distance and oversight, and let's call it, let's say, the accuracy around the use of violence. So I think one of the challenges here in understanding how these systems work is that they're only as good as the models that we teach them. And so I think a lot of the reporting on the use of AI systems thus far has tried to pick at, I think, what is the most pernicious challenge here, which is what qualifies you as a target for violence by the state. Is it because you happen to live close to someone who may or may not have been affiliated to a group? Is it because you happen to be a male of military age? Is it because you happen to live in a neighborhood which itself seems to have a certain number of potential targets, and therefore you are, reasonable collateral damage? So I think we've got a lot of questions around sort of the legality of the use of violence and proportionality and appropriate targeting for state violence in this moment. And unfortunately, many of the more stabilizing macro level kind of norms that we have agreed to, at least over the last 20 or 30 years, as it were, post-Cold War, have been eroded in recent years, right? We have major powers in the international system who are rethinking the need to commit to a kind of principled stability with a set of costs, or whether or not national interest, however it may be defined in the moment, sort of trumps the rest, no pun intended. And so I think these dynamics are difficult to analyze at the top level. It creates opportunities and space for abuse. And abuse here, I mean windows of opportunity for states that might not have chosen to use violence in the past to do so now. And there's the interesting story, I think, with the Iranian case is that one way in which that state has historically tried to protect itself or dissuade others from trying to change the way in which the regime operates is to outsource the violence that it can deliver to proxy actors or third parties. And what we're seeing, I think, play out in real time is that once the principal is being targeted with a significant amount of violence, all those agents are left to respond as they see fit or as they must. And so that diffuse and cascading effect, so violence on wide scale or at wide scale and across wider geographies, is something that I think we're all concerned about, especially because the end game and the objective seems very unclear.
Right, and the rise of terrorism as a result. And I think, just circling back to the earlier comments you were making, I just want to put like a pause button here, because it's not in the theory. The American military has a lot of access to intelligence, and yet it bombed. I mean, it's becoming revealed right now in real time that it was a mistake to bomb that school where those 160 girls were killed. So it's real.
Totally. Yeah. I think what's made it even harder, I think, or let's say what's made it more daunting to understand the implications of kind of this moment in time is that there's a certain amount of opacity that comes out whenever we see military action, largely because the very nature of its delivery has to be kept, confidential or secret. And it's certainly not in the interest of states to reveal errors that they've made. But we also, and for reasons of national security, we see less and less about what went into the decision-making process. And so the challenge, I think, and one of the impetus behind, writing the book as I've tried, is to say there's probably a threshold beyond which we're just not going to be able to know how these tools do get used in these spaces, because there's going to be a national security imperative that we don't talk about and that nobody talks about how they're being folded in, because that would be the very nature or those technologies are the very crux of the strategic advantage of the state. And so failing to sort of have those conversations early on, failing to regulate or at least commonly share practices around how these tools can be built with certain safeties and protections in mind, so that we don't sort of mistakenly escalate to massive conflict as a function of relying on improper tools. These conversations have to happen now, because they just won't later. And I think that's whenever we start talking about tools that change our cognitive labor, not just our physical and manual labor, that's a whole other echelon of concerns. And I don't think we've wrapped our heads around that, mostly because the technology itself is incomprehensible to so many.
Gosh, do we have to hope that there'll be leadership rising up with discernment like that to get there fast.
But one thing I actually, just on that note, and I think this is, one of the things that keeps me up at night more than other things, is actually we're going to have to watch out for the cohort effect. So there's going to be a bunch of individuals who actually burnish their professional, acumen, as it were, in the heart of these private sector firms, and they deliver real value to their nation. And those individuals in the later stages of their lives will make their way to the capital. And individuals who come out of Silicon Valley, for instance, in the US context, and then decide that their next act in life will be in that policy space, will be in those spaces where they are the political decision makers. I'm really concerned about whether or not they buy into the myths that they carry with them, or whether or not they're going to be reasonable observers and a good judge as to whether or not these systems are truly trustworthy enough to use. And so there's almost like a demographic buffer in place right now with an old guard, which is just not quite sure what this technology does and therefore is willing to take it a little bit slow. My concern is that when those demographics shift and different individuals with far different experiences and philosophies about what technology enables move into those spaces, then maybe some of those guardrails come down, and in ways that might be disadvantageous to us at the macro level. Now, I hope that's not true. That's just one of the things that I think about.
right. So let's just like keep ourselves up at night reflecting on that.
So yeah,
No,
not that
but
we need
good.
anything more to stay up and think about, but
I
that's
think
one of the things.
that's why I'm interested in these conversations, is that I want to become educated. I think more people need to become more educated and thoughtful about these potential risks. So final question before we kind of really consider the empathy question, or I have
Sure.
empathy questions. Okay, there's a lot of talk right now about asymmetric warfare. Your doctoral research focused on insurgencies and political violence. So, what lessons from insurgencies might help us understand how smaller actors might use AI against powerful states?
So I think the story that's often told right now in the military and security realm is that very inexpensive, easy to procure, build, or buy, as it were, systems and platforms, and these can be very small, and these can be medium sized or otherwise, can actually deliver significant damage to systems that are far more expensive, that are far harder to replace, that are far harder to mass produce. And so the asymmetry here is that with with a relatively smart brain, which in this case is more or less a microchip or two with the appropriate sort of onboard software, you can turn something that isn't that large into something that generates a significant amount of cost to somebody else. And so this is the story I think that's playing out in Eastern Europe right now. It's a success story in the case of the Ukrainians against a Russian aggressor, in their ability to sort of spin up strategically advantageous systems that can go after and execute, or at least deliver damage to large military systems, and that allows a smaller party to persist in ways that they wouldn't otherwise, and certainly violates a lot of the propositions that we usually carry about large armies versus small armies. So I think that's one way in which sort of asymmetry matters and will matter today. I think that given perhaps to sort of follow on with kind of the Iranian proxy story, there's also a sense that actors that are not state actors but are associated with states can take advantage of cheap technology to create either disruptions or cause harm in third or fourth countries, as it were. And so the second and third order effects of conflict become harder to contain because the ease with which we can deliver violence has, or at least it is that much easier, I should say, to deliver violence in different ways. So the one story, I suppose, that that matters perhaps most about asymmetric warfare, I think, in the context of today, is that it's a fool's errand to presume that we're going to be able to remove all of our enemies in the first place. And so I think there's a real narrative coming out of some capitals, national capitals, that if only through overwhelming might, perhaps, and a demonstration of sheer power, everybody else will essentially back down and stand down. And what's so glaringly wrong about that story is that that's precisely the opposite of what we've seen in, I'll go back to Eastern Europe here again, in the face of almost sure overwhelm. We've seen nothing but resolve and resistance. And that story is a durable and reaffirming human story if it's the right individual, well, not the right individuals, but those allies of ours that are doing the resisting. But it's also the case that violence used in a way that is poorly directed or without an objective that satisfies across enough populations is simply harm for harm's sake.
Mm-hmm.
And the real challenge here is getting entangled in conflicts that weren't worth fighting in the first place.
Right.
That excise, yeah, exactly. That excise a toll that nobody will be able to repay.
Right. Okay, so this is a podcast about empathy. I've got a few empathy related questions now.
Sure.
As former journalist, let's go back to that, who reported on conflicts. What did you learn about how stories shape public empathy? for war, and how AI might amplify or distort those narratives?
It's a good question. Um, I mean, not to be too pat about this, it is reasonable, I think, to argue that stories are one of our first technologies, perhaps our first technology. And so I think there is there's sort of a human urge and requirement that the disparate details and data and facts that we observe and encounter in the world can be ordered in some way. And so stories, whether right or wrong, tend to be the tools that we use to do that. Um, I think where the technology story of the present moment shifts and changes that a little bit is that we're living in a world with many stories, far too many stories, perhaps. And instead of finding that satisfying and or appropriately orienting, it can feel a little bit like it's far more fractured. And so because we're susceptible to a story well told, that both provides storytellers with a great deal of power, but it also, in this moment where if stories are more or less just text spilled out and delivered appropriately at the right time to the right person, there is a window of opportunity for AI technologies to do just that in more harmful ways, if not properly directed, or maybe in pro-social ways, if there was an approach to the use of these technologies that was I guess the question or the question I would always have for that second story, which is like, could it be pro-social? Of course, but who would be doing it, right? Who is the actor responsible for caretaking sort of in that knowledge and information space, the way that we've historically understood it? And this is where we get into this, slightly uncomfortable conversation about the most durable, but now in some ways most flawed institutions that we have, which tends to be the media. And so who do we rely on for the right story or the correct story, or the story that's as true as it can be, knowing the fact that we can't know anything? That's, it becomes difficult to know kind of what this present moment is going to result in. Will we see a frustration with the democratization of information and the stories that get told? So if everybody uses an AI agent to deliver a story that's unique to them, do they all sort of aggregate to some sort of better understanding? Or do we still, in those moments of uncertainty, do we still need some entity out there that can order and calibrate and pressure test some of the stories that we seem to be telling ourselves, to say, like, wait a second, no, there are better ones out there than others, and these are the ones that we should be spending our time thinking about. And so I as someone who was previously in that space, I believe that journalists today have a really difficult task, and yet at the same time, I know many of them to be engaged in this trade and craft because they believe that, like, the truth matters, and that individuals who spend time on it and can deliver it effectively do make a difference. And I want that to be true. I believe that can be true. Um, but it gets us back to some of these harder questions around how we organize kind of our lives vis-a-vis the politics that we sort of live within, and the trusted entities that we rely upon, and what those look like and whether or not those endure. And so, yeah, I think we're in this very complicated, complex, and far too noisy moment. And I'm not sure if AI in this instance creates more volume or appropriate signal.
I'm I'm channeling my Marshall McLuhan now, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not, I know, radio was a hot medium. I don't know what social media is. I imagine it's a hot medium too. It has to be a hot medium because it gets everybody
Yeah.
upset. So, if I think about radio's power in the Rwandan case, like, what could happen as yeah, when
Yeah.
stories are activated at a moment when everybody's ready to just sort of go wild with a story.
And I think one of the things that I try and wrap my head around, and I don't have a good answer for this one, but the thing that I think about is, maybe back to this kind of like mass surveillance, almost like the Big Brother-esque type assumption we sometimes carry into these technological spaces. My concern actually isn't that the information environment can be so orchestrated as to create a kind of follow-on phenomenon where everybody just gets on board and off we go. Instead, I'm a little bit more concerned about like the Hannah Arendt aspect of this story, which is that if there is just so much noise and so much difference, and there is no way for us to really understand what's true and what's false, then we actually lose a great deal of agency in our environment. We don't know what to do. And more importantly, we can't mobilize with others because nobody agrees on what it is that we're mobilizing against or for. And so I think it's the factionalization or the fracture of the information environment through additional or amplified noise, as it were. That's the thing that I think is more strategically concerning for democratic society than anything else. And again, that gets us a little bit adjacent to this like filter bubble problem, where we just worry that we'll all be sort of conspiracy theorists in our own ways. It's just to say there's just a plethora of potential truths. And if that's true, then what's true? And what should we all gather behind? And so I think that there is in the military, they talk about this, like no operation is successful unless we have a common operating picture. We have to know what we're doing, and we have to be jointly conversant in how we get to the end that we seek. And I think an information environment that gets fractured to the extent that we don't know what we're in this for and we don't know what we're trying to do means that none of us actually have great agency in our environments to begin with. And that would be where my sort of concern would lay.
And I think the older folks, might have a bit of a handle on the critical look at what the media stories are sharing. But I think there's a responsibility that we have regarding media literacy for the younger generations who don't have the discernment yet, either because their brains are that, or that's what the world that they grow into. Listen, Adam, I have 3 questions left. Do you still have time? 3? Yep.
Got it. Let's do it.
As machines become more powerful in shaping decisions about security and conflict, we've talked about that. What role should empathy play in the leaders and institutions that govern these technologies?
So at the highest levels, when the stakes couldn't be higher, when we're talking about the decisions around escalation or conflict, or the decision to wage war, go to war, defend against, I think, I'll go back to that, or at least my common refrain here, which is to say that we are, as humans and flawed decision makers, and knowing that we inhabit a world with other humans who are also flawed decision makers, there is a heightened requirement for strategic empathy at those highest levels in those crisis moments, precisely because if there's even a hint that you are less than certain about what the intentions of another might be, it is absolutely the truth that that other individual feels the same. And so there is, in that moment of shared vulnerability, that's the moment of what we hope is sort of strategic empathy, to say that actually that next step forward, that next step up the ladder of escalation, is actually in nobody's interest. And we know that because we must believe that the other individual sitting over on the other side, especially around matters of peace and war, the decision to tip into that latter category is almost always too expensive, right? It's almost always a mistake in terms of human capital lost as a function of that single decision. And so there is, I think, a need today and now across many sort of political offices to try and dial back the narratives around what we often call sort of strategic competition right now. This idea that we're in some sort of quick and maybe forever race for influence or authority or advantage or whatever it is. And I often wonder, like, for what? Like, to what end? Like, what happens if, well, we can't all win, and so what are we in it for, and how do we manage this? Um, I think empathy is a particularly, I mean, amazing but difficult quantity to sort of capture. If only because I think we're speaking for myself, and maybe I should put that on the table first. I think we're strangers to ourselves. I don't think we understand enough about how we really navigate the world. We take a lot of cues and guides from all sorts of others, and we read a lot from our structural environment that satisfices, as it were, for evidence to guide us as we move through space and time. And I think that those in charge, or those who occupy key positions in institutions, which is just, an amalgam of processes and people, they need to be really attentive to the fact that process can't and shouldn't take over, right? And that at the end, those human qualities that allow us to navigate uncertainty are essential. And how do you preserve them in spaces that you need them? And so in this way, when those individuals have to turn their eyes to questions around how technology gets used, how it gets folded into the spaces that they occupy, why or how they see it as a tool and not as the solution itself, like, these are really critical kind of moments. But there are also spaces in which I think a certain amount of education also has to go on. There's a certain amount of reminding that must be in play here, that we have to be okay with a certain amount of risk, but we also have to be okay with the fact that we're not going to have the answers to most of the questions that we seek to answer. And we have to realize that everybody in similar positions, wherever they might be in the world, are finding it just as difficult to be there too. And I think that whether empathy leads to humility or vice versa, I'm not sure, but those two things packaged together become pretty essential.
So I feel like I kind of know where you're going to land on this next question, but I'll ask it anyways. If you believe that empathy can actually function as a strategic strength in international relations, not just a moral ideal.
Yeah, no, I think so. We spent a lot of, one of the more interesting intersections of research is sort of political psychology. And so the psychology of decision making is obviously quite critical here. But this, at least within the tradition, is stitched into a lot of the theories that we hold around how the international system operates and how states in the international system operate, and a lot of assumptions as to why we find states go to war in the first place. And I think the finding persistently across most of these, let's call them generations of research, is that the fundamental stumbling blocks are the same. We have all sorts of biases that we don't really understand, and we can't necessarily identify in the moment. And yet we know and have tried over time to design decision environments that are slightly more effective, because we recognize that those biases sort of persist. And it seems like this present moment, we're sort of being told a fundamentally different story in a very concerning way, which is that we can actually remove bias from the equation entirely, because we're going to mechanize and technologize the decision-making process so that humans aren't involved. But the problem is that most of those biases, I should say most, but let's say a handful of those biases, are actually the things that keep us from being too bullish and too certain about the decisions that we're going to make in the first place. And so we have this awkward, catch-22 moment as humans in this space, which is to say, no, our fallibility and our inefficiencies are actually our advantage, because they should remind us that we can't be certain and shouldn't be certain about what we're doing. And yet, they're also the things that we've identified as, the limitations, as it were, for being faster, more effective, more efficient, and everything else. And so we've got this real tussle that goes on between technology and sort of the human condition. And I do believe that emotions and empathy are critical ingredients in terms of how we understand international affairs. And our world would be poorer and far more conflictual were they to be removed.
Yeah, and I don't often quote Rumsfeld, but it kind of helps that we at least can admit that there are some unknowns that are unknown.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. The world is confounding, and it should remain so.
Okay, last question. This is what I ask of all my guests, regardless of topic. So this is going to feel a little different. Adam, can you share a moment from your personal life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Interesting. I feel like my answer is going to be lackluster, but principled, perhaps. I suppose there isn't one that I would pinpoint, perhaps, as sort of like an inflection point, as it were, in my experience of empathy. What I will say, though, is amidst our present moment, where I think a lot of us can be convinced that we're out here alone and struggling alone with the complexity of our world, to have somebody who shows up, whether it's someone close to you or a friend or otherwise, and sits in your space, occupies that same sort of like thought environment as much as the emotional environment, becomes a real salve against, and in some ways, a protection against what can otherwise seem like a scary world out there. And so I think it's much like there are too many things vying for our attention these days. I think the ability to sit commonly in the shit, as it were, or uncomfortably with somebody else, and to try just for a moment to feel the world from their perspective, that's a human superpower, right? That's something that perhaps other animals can do such things and we don't know, but that's certainly something unique to us and something that can't and won't be replicated by any amazing technology that we build. So at the heart of that sense of like community and connection, that's a sense of like that oneness that doesn't come from anything other than the willingness of another to spend a little bit of their time, like that resource you don't get more of, to live in your world, even if just for a moment, and to say, you know what, I get it, and I feel that too. And sometimes I am you, right? And so for me, I've been lucky enough along the way to have people who have been more or less confused about their life and the world, and they've chosen to do that to be that in parallel and in time with me. And I can't speak highly enough of that. So that's probably not exactly the answer you were looking for, but that's how I think empathy has made its way into my life, and it is a priceless good at that.
Yeah, what I hear is we need each other. We need each other.
Yeah. More than ever.
More than ever. Well, Adam, I'm happy to know that you are in Ottawa as a policy analyst, maybe, whispering to the powers that be about how we need to slow down and be reflective about this. This has been a very, very rich conversation, one that I will probably have to listen to a second time to really catch all of it. I'm sure some listeners and viewers are nodding with me, but this has been really an exceptional delve into the implications of AI in modern military, foreign policy and some, how we are going to be as humans going forward. So thank you.
No, and thank you for the time. I mean, there's never enough of it, but what's amazing about conversations like this is we also don't create space for reflection. And I think the ability to do that with you today has been fruitful for me as well. And so thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, good luck taking the price of certainty across the finish line. We want to thank everybody who's been watching and listening for doing so, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll check out other episodes from this series devoted to empathy in the age of AI. And if you know someone who would enjoy the show, I hope you'll pass